Howdy gang, this is Jerry, and today I wanted to talk about my new RC car. It's an ARRMA Granite Mega 4x4. This is the new one that just came out last fall. I picked up one of these trucks a couple of weeks ago, and I'm not really ready to do an overall video about the truck yet, but I wanted to talk about the slip clutch in the truck, which is what I have spread out across me, and more specifically the Spur Gear. This guy right here is the Spur Gear that comes with the truck, and it is a 48 pitch Spur Gear, and if you can see, I have burned that one up. And the reason why I burned it up is because I put way too much power in my truck. I got bored pretty quick with the brushed motor that comes in this truck, and since ARRMA does not yet offer it with a brushless power, that's your only option, is the brushed motor. And I had an extra BLX 185, for those of you that know ARRMA, that is their 1/8 scale power system. This is a 4074 size motor, 2000 kV, big honking horsepower, barely fits in the truck, but it does fit. And so I put that guy in there with a 5mm bore 48 pitch pinion, and this was the result. It just blew the teeth right off the gear. No surprise, right? Too much horsepower. So that leads me to this. And on the ARRMA forums, there was a guy that had a thread where they replaced it with this gear. Well, he didn't actually use this gear, but this is a Yeti spurts from the Axial Yeti. And the gentleman, his forum name is Megasty, something like that. And he used the Hot Racing Steel 60 tooth. This is the 56 tooth plastic gear. I didn't want to invest too much money in this until I was sure I could make it work, and now that I think that it's more or less going to work, I'll probably go ahead and order the Hot Racing Steel gear. But just wanted to kind of talk about how this stack is put together. So on this end we have the stock ARRMA pressure plate, the stock cross pin, and then these three parts are the Yeti parts. The Yeti slip clutch, the Spur Gear, and then not the slip clutch, the slipper disc, and the Spur Gear and the slipper disc. Next up, I have a couple of washers that these are just kind of gap fillers. Actually, I have two washers here shown. The proper size I probably should have used was this one here. This is a M10 washer, but it ended up being a little bit too thick, and so I had this washer, which is a 3/8 inch stainless washer that's about 1/2 millimeter thinner, and I'll talk more about why I needed this thinner washer in a minute. And this is part of the reason why I needed the thinner washer. This is a spacer that I made. It is a 10 millimeters on the inside diameter ID and 5 millimeters wide, and this was just a piece of scrap stainless steel tubing I had laying around the shop, and I cut it off to length and ground it and polished it and such. And I'll get to more about that in another minute. And then the back half of the clutch, so far I am using the stock shaft, the stock spacer, stock bearing, stock spring, and the stock nut. There was some discussion that maybe a M8 nylock could fit, and so I bought a M8 nylock. And if you can look at the threads in there, you can see this red nut has very fine threads. This nut has it's a M8 1.5, so the threads are 1.5 pitch threads. That was all they had at this hardware store I was at, so I'm guessing this is probably a standard pitch thread and this is a fine pitch thread, something like that. So I'm going to need to see if I can source some M8 fine threads, and I have no idea what the actual pitch will end up being. I'm just going to have to buy some and experiment. So a couple of gotchas that I'm going to talk about this. Also, it's on the Yeti Spur Gear. You can see I have this little metal sleeve in here, and this metal sleeve is actually just a strip of an aluminum can that it doesn't want to come out of here now, but can I push it out? And you can see that it's writing on it from the outside of the aluminum can. And I just cut a strip of the aluminum can about 4 inches long and about 1/8 of an inch wide. And then I wrapped it in there and kind of measured it and trimmed off the end until I got it to about the right length that basically made a spiral wound gasket in there, a spiral wound spacer, till I had it made it up to a nice slop-free spacer. So that was one fix that I had to do. And then back to this nut, for this spacer, I think probably a better idea, most people probably won't have just scrap tubing lying around their shop. Probably would be a better idea to just go ahead and buy a cheap bearing. You can buy bearings for about $1 a piece. And if you buy a bearing that has a 10 millimeter inside diameter and a 4 millimeter width, who cares how big the outside diameter is? And when you get that bearing, just disassemble it for the inside race and use that. And again, my spacer is 5 millimeters, but I think if you used a 4 millimeter wide bearing, this would come out better, because at that point you could use a standard M10 washer instead of having to find something that's a little bit extra thin like I had to do. Okay. One last tidbit. This cross pin is kind of an interesting critter to get into, and I'll show a little bit more about how it goes in. But it goes into this hole here, which mates up with the hole that's in the I've got this holding it backwards here, the hole there. And that doesn't sound like too big a deal, except that you have to have it sanded. It's difficult to do. I'll just show it when I get there. But this here is invaluable. This is just a 1.5 millimeter. It doesn't have. This is an MIP, but you don't have to use MIP. And I put a little neodymium magnet on here, and now I can use this as a holder for this little cross pin, and I can even stick it on the end here, and it'll hold it straight out. And this is invaluable. Without this, I would have gone mad long before I actually had this project finished. So let's go ahead and try to assemble this stack. So I'm going to start with the shaft, and it has the stock spacer on here. It just slides off with the bearing on it. So that guy just slides on there. I'm going to put my spacer on there, and again, if you do this yourself, you might be better to use a bearing race. I'll grab my washer, throw it on there. Slip disc number 1, throw it on there. The spur, put it on there. And now I've just got to kind of spend just a moment here and make sure that this slip plate or pressure plate, or whatever you want to call it, is snapped in correctly. And now we turn it there, you can see the hole pin. And now you might be able to kind of see where I'm going to be having a problem in a minute. Snap that one, make sure it's seated into place. And now when I put this guy on here to put the pin in place, check that action out. You have to be able to fit that pin in there in that little thin gap. Okay, and that's where this tool is worth its weight in gold, because now I can just drop. The first 3 or 4 times I assembled and disassembled this guy, I just used some needle nose pliers and a lot of cursing to get it into place. And even with this little tool, it's still not always easy. Let me try this one more time here. Okay, so I think I have everything lined up now, so let's try this again. It started to go in, but then the pressure plate backed out just a little bit. Phooey. There we go. Slid it right in that time. And you have to be kind of careful to not get it too vertical, because that pin will just slide right out the backside if you're not careful, and it almost did that just now. And there we go. So now it's just a matter of tidying up all the plates, and I'm okay. So that's most of the slipper stack here. All we have left is the spring and the red nut. One check here is, as you put it together, you need a couple of threads here exposed. If the spring is covering all of the threads, then something in the stack is too tall, and you're going to have to reevaluate and find either a thinner spacer or a thinner washer or something. And the reason why that gets to be important, I'll just kind of hand tighten this on a little bit here. When you actually get down to installing it in the gearbox, snap it back together, you see everything is fitting nice and flush. And that was where this other washer that I mentioned, this metric washer for myself, didn't work. Is because when I went to snap the case back together, there was a gap all the way around. And so when I went to spin the gear, it wouldn't spin free, it was binding up. So that is my spur conversion on this. If you got any questions, post them up. Talk to you later. Bye.